I sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of glossy pages spread across the wood like some kind of shrine to ambition and delusion. 70-plus sheets filled with graphs and promises, and the kind of language that sounds expensive but means nothing once you peel away the shine. And as I ran my fingers over the cover of that presentation, I felt a slow, cold heaviness form in the center of my chest, because I knew exactly whose dream I was holding and exactly how many times I had already paid for it, and the silence in the kitchen carried the memory of the woman who used to sit across from me, sipping tea, while we talked about our boy, about how he would find his way, how he would learn from mistakes, how he just needed time to grow into himself. And now 3 years had passed since she left, and every time I thought about her, I felt that same ache, that same twisting grief that came from knowing she never got the chance to see how complicated her son's life would become, and how quickly he was drifting from everything she tried to teach him. And I looked down at the deck again, remembering each chapter of his big ideas. The first time he came home with excitement buzzing in his voice, talking about beer and subscriptions and revolutionizing how people discovered local breweries, and I remembered the way he believed in it so fiercely, and how I believed in him just as hard, how I pulled money out of my retirement fund because I wanted him to have the chance. I never did the chance to try something bold without fear of falling, and when it collapsed, I held him while he cried, told him failure wasn't the end, told him people who build anything worth building have to walk through failure first, and I meant every word. Then came the second venture, the app, the dog walkers, the booking, the idea that felt more grounded, and I remember giving him what he needed, because the woman I loved asked me to never stop supporting him, never stop believing in the light she saw inside him. And I watched him pour himself into that idea, only to watch it crumble the same way the first one did. And then grief took her from us, and I watched it take a piece of him too, watched him sit at her bedside, promising he would do better, would be wiser, would grow into the kind of man she always believed he could be, and I held on to that promise long. After he drifted away from home, moved to the city, stopped, calling stopped, answering stopped, remembering that his father was still alive on the other end of the phone line, and each unanswered message felt like another thin crack in something I thought was unbreakable, until months passed with nothing but silence, and then suddenly, there he was, at my door, smiling like he hadn't vanished, like he hadn't left me wondering if he was alive or hurt or simply done with me, and standing beside him was a woman who looked polished in a way that didn't fit our small, quiet house, a woman with eyes that scanned rooms, like she was assessing value, not comfort. And the moment she spoke, I felt something in my gut shift, not because she was rude, not because she was loud, but because every word she used felt rehearsed, like she delivered the same speech to many people before, and when they sat on my couch and placed that thick presentation in front of me, I felt the weight of every dream I'd already helped fund, and the fear of how I woke the next morning with a heaviness pressing against my ribs, the kind that settles in after a night spent pretending sleep will untangle what the heart already knows. And I walked into the kitchen, still littered with the pages from the night before, each one a reminder of how far my son had drifted from the boy who used to run barefoot through the yard, shouting for me to watch him climb the old tree by the fence. And I stood there, staring at the deck again, unable to avoid the sinking truth that none of this came from him. Not the tone, not the planning, not the hunger in the numbers. Every part of it had the fingerprints of someone else, someone who whispered in his ear until her voice replaced his own. And as I poured coffee, my hands felt heavier than the mug, because grief has a way of pulling memories forward without permission, and I found myself thinking of the woman I loved, the way she used to press her hand over mine and tell me that our boy would grow out of the recklessness, that he would find his way, that he needed guidance, not discipline, love, not pressure. And I wondered what she would think if she saw him now sitting beside a woman who treated him like a tool, a mouthpiece, a means to her own ambition. And I took a long breath before dialing his number, because some part of me still hoped there was room for honesty, hoped he might listen, hoped he might remember. I was not the enemy. But the line rang twice, then went quiet before his voice came in, too bright, too eager, too ready to sell the dream again. And I told him I had reviewed everything, every projection, every paragraph, every promise, and the silence that followed cracked faintly like ice on a lake, just beginning to break. And he asked slowly what I thought, what I was willing to do, and I told him plainly that I could not fund something built on hope, instead of structure, something that asked for more than he understood, something that belonged more to the woman beside him than to him. And I said it gently, because he was still my son, still the boy who once cried when he broke a toy and thought he had disappointed me beyond repair. But the reaction that came was not his, it was hers, sharp, rehearsed, slicing right through him as she took the phone from his hand and unleashed a barrage of confidence layered with condescension, telling me I was holding him back, telling me I lacked vision, telling me this was the future and I had no place in it unless I learned to think bigger. And I listened, letting her words pour through the receiver like cold water, until finally I spoke the only truth that mattered, that I would not invest, not now, not ever. And her voice twisted sharp as metal, accusing me of failing him, calling me selfish, small-minded, weak, and I hung up on her mid-sentence because I would not let her carve me open again, and for a long moment I stood there breathing slowly, letting the quiet fill the room again, but the peace did not last long. My phone lit up seconds later, buzzing with message after message from my son, his voice fractured between her fury and his panic caught between wanting to please her and wanting to respect me, begging me to reconsider, telling me this was his chance, telling me he needed me, telling me I owed him after all the years he had been my son. And those words stung more than any insult, because they revealed something I had refused to see until now, that in his mind, love was a ledger, and I was expected to pay and pay and pay until he decided the balance was enough. And I felt something inside me snap, not violently, but quietly, the way old rope finally breaks after years of strain, and I sent one message back, a single line telling him I loved him but I would not finance destruction, masked as opportunity. And his response came instantly, filled with heat and blame and phrases that did not sound like him, phrases a person uses when they want to wound, not communicate. And then another message arrived, longer, crueler, tearing at the memory of his mother, accusing me of wasting the years after her death, accusing me of being bitter, controlling, fearful, and by the time I reached the end, my hands were cold, my breath shallow, because I realized he had let her shape not just his dreams but his anger too. And I put the phone down and walked outside into the early morning air, letting the cold settle into my lungs, because sometimes it is the only thing that can steady a shaking heart. And as I stood on the porch watching the first edge of sunlight slip over the horizon, I knew that this was no longer about money or dreams or business. It was about the truth, finally clawing its way to the surface, that my son was lost, not in failure, but in the echo of someone else's ambition, someone who saw him as a ladder, not a partner. And if I did not step carefully, he would try to use me as the final rung, and I could not let that happen, not to him, not to myself, not to the memory of the woman who believed he could be better. The following day arrived with a tension so thick it felt like the air itself resisted moving, and I carried that heaviness around the house like an invisible weight, trying to distract myself with small tasks, cleaning the counter, wiping the table, rinsing a mug. But every motion looped me back to the same truth, that something inside my son had fractured into a shape I no longer recognized. And I sat in the living room waiting, knowing the call would come, because people who are desperate for money do not sit quietly after hearing the word no. And right on cue, the phone lit up, buzzing across the wood like a trapped insect, announcing the storm before it even formed. And the moment I answered, I heard it, not his voice, not the boy I raised, not the young man the woman loved, but hers, the sharp, cutting tone, dripping with entitlement and venom, as she demanded to know what gave me the right to refuse. What kind of father would deny such an opportunity? How I could live with myself if their dream collapsed because of me. And I listened without interrupting, without giving her any piece of myself, because I understood that responding would only feed the fire. She wanted to burn through both of us, and when she finally paused long enough for him to speak, I heard the panic in his voice, the fear of losing her approval, the desperation of someone fighting two battles at once. And he tried to sound strong, tried to sound righteous, but the tremble in his words cracked through like lightning, revealing everything he was trying to hide. And he told me I had betrayed him, told me he needed me, told me I was turning my back on him when he needed support the most, and I felt that old ache rising in me, that old instinct to protect him, to lift him, to save him from himself. But then her voice cut back in sharper, louder, demanding. I reconsider calling me pathetic, calling me a coward, calling me a burden in his life, and that was the moment the part of me tied to guilt and obligation finally went quiet, replaced by something steadier, something older, something that had been sleeping since the woman I loved passed, a sense of boundary she carried effortlessly, and I told them the truth that I would not give them the money, that their plan was not a plan but a gamble, and that I would not throw my future into a fire just because they insisted it was the only path forward, and the silence that followed was not silence at all. It was the gathering of a storm, and I felt it before it erupted, the full force of her rage pouring through the phone, her insults escalating, her accusations twisting as she hurled every word she could find to bruise me and break me. And when he finally snapped, shouting that I never supported him, that I never believed in him, that everything I had done had been meaningless, something inside me cracked, not in pain but in clarity, because I knew he believed those words in that moment, because she wanted him to, and he needed someone to blame. And blaming me was easier than admitting he had lost his own way, and the call ended with a threat, not from him but from her, a cold, calculated promise that if I would not help them, I would be cut out of their lives forever. And when the line went dead, the silence in the room felt thick, heavy, pressing into my skull, and I sat there staring at the phone, realizing that the boy I raised, the man I hoped he would become, had been swallowed whole by someone else's hunger, and he did not even see it happening, and hours passed in a fog while I tried to make sense of how everything had collapsed so quickly, how 3 years of grief had hollowed him so deeply that he clung to the first person who promised him the world, even if she built that promise on the bones of everyone he loved. And then, just before sunset, the message arrived, long, frantic, unstable, accusing me of ruining their dream, accusing me of choosing money over family, accusing me of spitting on his future, and the final line cut through me, not because it hurt, but because it revealed the truth. He wrote that he wished his mother were still alive because she would have given him anything. And I closed my eyes because the woman he remembered was not the woman he was invoking. She would have seen through the woman beside him. She would have protected him from the very path he was sprinting down, and she would have known exactly what I was forced to face now that our son was lost inside someone else's ambitions. And as the sky darkened outside, I realized this was not the end of the conflict. This was only the point where the truth became too heavy to avoid, the moment when love stopped being enough to keep me silent, and the moment I finally understood that protecting him now meant refusing him, no matter how deeply it cut. More he would ask for now, and the woman kept talking about vision and disruption and transformation and income streams and the universe rewarding boldness, and I kept watching my son's face, noticing how he looked to her before finishing his sentences, noticing how much of his confidence came from her approval, not his own belief. And as they outlined the enormous sum, they wanted my head buzzed with disbelief, because they spoke of that money like it was candy, like it was nothing, like it didn't represent the lifetime of work. The woman I loved had stood beside me for the decades it took to save it, and I felt that ache. Again, that ache of knowing she would have seen through this before the first. The page was flipped, and when they finally left, when the door shut and my house sank back into old familiar quiet, I picked up that deck and forced myself to read every line, every claim, every promise, every projection. And the further I read, colder I became, because none of it held weight, none of it held structure, none of it held truth. It was smoke painted gold. And I sat there long into the night, staring at the pile of dreams that weren't his but hers, and at the realization that if I didn't step carefully, I might lose the last real piece of him I had left. The days that followed bled together in a way that felt unreal, like time itself was holding its breath, waiting to see which part of my life would shatter next. And every morning, I woke with that same tightness curled behind my ribs, the kind that comes from knowing a blow is coming, but not knowing when it will land. And each time the phone lit up with his name or hers, I let it ring until the screen went dark again, because I knew nothing good would come from opening that door again. And by the fourth day, the messages shifted from anger to guilt, from guilt to pleading, from pleading to long, paragraphs written in her voice pretending to be his, using the same turns of phrase, the same rehearsed urgency, the same polished manipulation, and the moment I saw her words masquerading as his, something inside me settled with a final quiet click, because there it was, the truth I had not wanted to accept. She was steering him completely, shaping his fears, his anger, his choices, until he no longer knew where her thoughts ended and his began. And I read the messages only once, then deleted them because they were not conversations. They were snares, designed to drag me back into the same cycle that had drained me for years. And that night, the sky fell into a slow, heavy blue. I sat alone with the grief of it all, the grief of losing my son, not to death, not to distance, but to the gravity of someone who fed the weakest parts of him until he mistook dependency for devotion. And I felt the ache of the woman I loved rise again because she would have known what to do. She was the one who carried the fire in the family, the one who could slice through manipulation with a single raised eyebrow, the one who would have seen this woman for exactly what she was even before the first lie left her mouth, and the thought that our son had been taken in by someone she would have protected him from, twisted deep in my chest, and yet even in that pain, realized something she had tried to teach me for years, that love means telling the truth, even when the truth is the sharpest blade in the room. And as night deepened, the phone buzzed again, a video call flashing across the screen, and for a moment I nearly ignored it, but something in my gut told me to answer, not to negotiate, not to be persuaded, but to witness what I needed to see. And when I picked up the call, his face appeared first, flushed, frantic, his eyes darting, the way a man looks when he is trapped between his own decisions and consequences he cannot outrun. And then she stepped into the frame, standing behind him, her hand gripping his shoulder like a warning, and she began speaking, for him again, telling me they were giving me one last chance, telling me that if I truly loved him, I would liquidate everything, telling me that family is measured by what you are willing to surrender. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I didn't feel shaken or confused or cornered. I felt calm, almost unnervingly so, and I looked directly at him, not her, and told him that if he wanted a true relationship with me, he would need to come without her voice in, his mouth come as the person he used to be, before ambition and grief and loneliness made him an easy target. And the moment those words left my lips, everything broke. His expression flickered with something raw, something almost like recognition. But she reacted first, yanking the phone closer and unleashing a fury of insults, threats, emotional daggers, thrown with the precision of someone who had practiced them for years, calling me useless, calling me jealous, calling me a failure as a husband, as a parent, as a man, and he just stood there, absorbing her rage, letting it hit him too, because that is the price of loving someone who feeds. On control, they teach you to accept the blows as if they are part of the deal. And when I finally hung up, the silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the entire house was exhaling for the first time in months. And the next morning came with rain, soft and steady, tapping against the windows, like a reminder that some endings do not arrive with thunder. They arrive with quiet inevitability. And as I watched the water trail down the glass, I realized there was only one path left, the one I had avoided because it felt too final, too heavy, too painful. But now it was the only way to protect what remained of myself and the memory of the woman who trusted me to guide our son, even when she could no longer stand beside me. And I started gathering documents, financial statements, life insurance, records, retirement papers, everything I had built across decades of work and sacrifice, and with each folder I stacked, I felt the truth solidify. He would not stop asking until there was nothing left, would keep coming as long as I existed as a source of rescue, and the woman beside him would keep sharpening his need into a weapon, and the only way to free either of us was to let go fully, not with anger, not with blame, but with the acceptance that sometimes love can only survive distance and boundary, so absolute it feels like loss, even when it is the only path to any future at all. I spent the next morning moving through the house with a kind of quiet that felt almost ceremonial, gathering the last pieces of my old life as if I were packing the bones of something long dead, and I kept telling myself I was prepared. I kept insisting that I had already grieved the loss of my son, long before any of this began. But the truth slid into me slowly. That grief is never clean. It pools in corners, rises without warning, and even as I stood at the kitchen counter, stacking documents into envelopes, a part of me trembled with the memory of the boy he once was, the boy who used to run into my arms, the boy who trusted me without hesitation, and that memory pressed against the hollow place inside me where hope used to live, but I refused to let it decide for me now, and I stepped outside into the cool breeze, carrying the envelopes like they were both shield and confession, and drove into town to meet with the advisor, whose voice had steadied me through the darkest parts of my life after the woman loved was gone, and her expression tightened the moment I explained what I needed, not with judgment, but with the solemn understanding of someone who has watched too. Many parents bleed themselves dry for children who cannot see the damage they cause, and she walked me through the steps, each one more final, more irreversible than the last, the restructuring, the withdrawals, the protections, the decisions that would seal the future in a way that left no door unlocked for manipulation to sneak through. And as I signed my name over and over, a cold clarity settled in me. This was not abandoning my son. This was protecting the part of me that still remained, the part that had survived grief and betrayal, and the slow erosion of trust that happened when love becomes a leverage point for someone else's ambition. And when the final signature dried, she slid the paperwork toward me with a gentle nod, as if to say it is done. And there was a strange stillness inside me, not relief, not sadness, something between the two, something like exhaling after holding my breath for far too long, and the drive home felt unreal. The sky washed in muted color, the road stretching out like a long thread pulling me away from a version of myself that could never return. And when I reached the house, the phone was buzzing again, the screen filled with messages from both of them, sharp, begging, venomous, fragile, all tangled together in a desperate net, and I didn't open a single one because I already knew the shape of their words. I already knew the rhythm of panic turning into threats, turning into manipulation, turning into guilt, and I had finally learned that listening to those words did not help him, did not help me, and did not honor the woman who once trusted us to become better men than this. And the next morning came with an unexpected quiet. No calls, no messages, nothing except the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, reminding me gently that life continues even when something inside you feels like it has cracked. And I spent the day sorting through boxes, placing them in the hallway, loading them into the car because I knew I could not stay here much longer. This house carried too many echoes, too many shadows, too many memories of her and him side by side before life hardened him into someone who could not hear anything except the voice of the woman who used him as fuel for her ambition. And that evening, I walked down to the edge of the yard where the light from the setting sun spilled across the grass in long, warm strokes, and I let myself think of him one last time. Not the man he had become, but the boy he had been. The boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during thunderstorms, the boy who once asked me if I thought he would grow up to make us proud, and I whispered into the fading air that he still could, that he still might. That life has a way of bending people back toward themselves once the illusions burn away, and I felt my throat tighten with the truth that loving someone sometimes means stepping away, so they can finally see what they have become, without the safety net beneath them. And when I turned back toward the house, night had settled across every window, making the rooms look unfamiliar, distant, as if the place itself had already begun letting go of me. And I understood then with a deep, aching calm that this chapter was ending, not because I wanted it to end, but because it had nowhere left to go, and the only thing left to do was honor the boundary I had built with the quiet strength the late woman had taught me, and in that stillness, with the last of the daylight fading behind the trees, I felt the faintest flicker of peace, not triumph, not closure, but a soft, steady acceptance that I had done what I needed to do for him, for myself, and for the part of our family that still lived inside me even now. The morning I finally left the house for good, the sky was pale and empty in a way that made everything feel paused, like even the sun was hesitant to rise on the version of my life I was walking into, and I loaded the last box into the car with hands that did not shake, not because I felt strong, but because the decision had already settled into me so completely there was no room left for wavering. And as I closed the trunk, the quiet around me felt different, heavier, but clean, the kind of quiet that follows a long storm, when you step outside and realize nothing looks the same, and nothing ever will again. And I stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the past weeks press through me, letting myself acknowledge the grief, the exhaustion, the strange calm that came when the heart finally accepts a truth too big to fight. And then I got into the car and drove away without looking back, because some endings need that clean break, the kind you feel in your chest like a door closing gently but permanently, and the road stretched long and familiar at first, then strange, then peaceful as miles placed themselves between me and the big house where I had loved and lost, and the further I got, the lighter the air felt, as if each turn was peeling another layer of fear from my shoulders, and by the time I reached the edge of the coastal town, the tension inside me had thinned just enough for breath to move freely again. And the life that unfolded next came softly the way new growth pushes through soil after winter, cautious at first, then steady and sure. I learned the sounds of the harbor, the cries of gulls, the rhythm of fishing boats returning at dawn. I learned the way old men at the diner leaned in close to hear each other's stories, and how strangers in a small town recognize loneliness without asking questions. I let myself be a comparate, quiet figure, repairing furniture for neighbors, sharing coffee with people who had no expectations of me, offering help, not because they needed saving, but because community is built from small acts, not grand sacrifices. And my days slipped into a gentle routine, the kind I never knew I wanted, the kind built from silence and ease, and the soft relief of knowing no one was waiting to take and take until I had nothing left. And then one afternoon, months later, when the air carried the first cool breath of autumn, I heard the familiar crunch of tires on gravel, and for a moment my chest tightened on instinct, the old fear flickering through me, before I recognized the figure stepping out of the car, and he stood there for a long moment, at the edge of the yard, like a man approaching the ruins of a life he once destroyed, unsure if he had the right to walk any closer. And when he finally did, his steps were slow, unsteady, almost apologetic, and the man who stopped a few feet from me looked nothing like the one who had spit venom through the phone. Months before, he looked smaller, thinner, quieter, like someone who had been stripped down to the truth without mercy. And he opened his mouth, but no words came out, just a shaky breath that broke something inside me, because I could see it clearly, the regret, the collapse, the painful recognition of how much damage he had done and how far he had fallen. And when he finally managed to speak, his voice cracked on the first word, and he admitted everything, not with excuses, not with anger, but with the raw honesty of someone who has hit the bottom and found nothing but themselves waiting there. He told me the woman was gone, left him when the money ran out, left him when the fantasy collapsed, left him when she realized he had no one left to exploit. He told me the debt collectors had come, the friends had vanished, the dream had evaporated, and he was alone, truly alone, in a way he never imagined possible. And he said, the words I had never expected to hear, that he was sorry, deeply, painfully, sincerely. Sorry not just for the money or the manipulation, but for the things he said, for the way he weaponized grief against me, for the way he used the memory of the woman we both loved as a tool to pry open my loyalty. And as he spoke, something inside me softened. Not because I forgot what he had done, not because apology erases wounds, but because I finally heard him, not the man twisted by ambition, not voice puppeted by someone else, but the child I raised, the one buried under years of fear and failure and misguided hope. And he asked, not for forgiveness, but for a chance to become someone worthy of her memory, someone worthy of my trust, someone worthy of his own name, again. And I let the silence sit between us long enough for truth to settle into the space. And then I nodded, not a full embrace, not blind reconciliation, but the first small opening, the first breath of something new, and his shoulders dropped in a way that told me he had been carrying a weight I could not see. And we sat on the porch watching the ocean move, steady and patient, and for the first time in a long time, the ache inside me loosened, and I understood that healing was not a return to what once was, but the creation of something entirely different. And as the sun dipped low, casting gold across the water, I felt the quiet presence of the woman we both missed, like a warmth settling on my shoulder, as if she were telling us both that pain can break a family, but truth can build one again, piece by fragile piece. And in that moment I realized I was no longer looking at the son who betrayed me, but at the man who was finally ready to come home.